Hey everyone, welcome to session 248 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by doctors Whitney Ence and Elisabeth Sheridan to talk about the diagnosis of autism. You might be thinking that this sounds like an impossibly broad topic, and of course you're right. But in this show, we tried to narrow it down a bit to discuss the various routes in which people can acquire an autism diagnosis. We talked about which of these routes represent best practice, the critical diagnostic features of autism, severity levels in autism, and the extent to which these terms are useful or perhaps not useful, the role of intense interests, specific assessment instruments and techniques, and the importance of working with interdisciplinary teams. We also talk about how the diagnosis has evolved over the years, including the retirement of terms such as pervasive developmental disorder and Asperger syndrome. During this part of the conversation, we also discussed self-diagnosis of autism and how clinics sometimes triage screening for individuals seeking diagnoses. Towards the end of the show, we did touch on a few terms and topics that are relatively new to the autism discourse. Specifically, we discussed the term neurodiversity. We talked about the social model of disability, severe autism as a separate diagnosis, and pathological demand avoidance. It's important to note that this part of the podcast shouldn't be construed with a deep exploration of these topics, as I really wanted to initially focus on what the current state of the science has to say about the diagnosis of autism as a condition requiring medically necessary treatment. If there are things we mentioned in the podcast that you want to learn more about, I suggest heading over to behavioralobservations.com to check out the show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the mailing list so you can get the show notes for these episodes delivered directly to your inbox. I also want to draw your attention to what could be considered a companion podcast about the diagnostic characteristics of autism. I'm in the middle of listening to a long episode from the Huberman Lab podcast, in which Dr. Andrew Huberman interviews Dr. Karen Parker from Stanford University about the causes and treatments for autism. This is from a more neurobiological perspective, and thus far the show is pretty interesting, so you might be well served by checking it out. But back to this episode, though, I am grateful for Whitney and Elisabeth to spend some time with me to share their expertise. And if you want to find out more about them and their work, once again, just check out this episode's show notes. And if you want to receive Behavioral Observations episodes ad-free and commentary-free, that is just the interviews themselves, consider supporting the show with a Patreon subscription. Another way to support the show is to consider Behavioral Observations as a source for your continuing education. I have almost 50 events that span a variety of topics, all from your favorite podcast guests. So if you want to catch up on your professional development while walking the dog, commuting to work, making dinner, or whatever else you do while listening to the podcast, go to behavioralobservations.com/getCEUs to learn more. One more thing before we get to the interview. The Verbal Behavior Conference is right around the corner. If you haven't heard me talk about it before, the VBC is a 2-day event that is available both virtually and in person in Austin, Texas. It's happening on February 29th and March 1st. It will feature speakers like Drs. Pat McGreevy, Alice Schillingsberg, Barbara Esch, and more. There's even a full-day pre-conference workshop by Dr. Lena Slim. That's on the 28th of February. This is a really fun event that provides many opportunities for individuals to interact directly with the speakers, and there's even a panel discussion moderated by, yours truly. So to learn more, go to behaviorlive.com/VBC or simply hit the show notes for this episode. All right, I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, please enjoy this conversation with Drs. Whitney Ence and Elisabeth Sheridan.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sicoria.
All right, I'm here with Drs. Whitney Ence and Elisabeth Sheridan. We're talking about the assessment of autism spectrum disorder. And man, do we have a lot of questions to talk about and to go over. So thank you folks for joining me today. How are you guys doing?
Great. Thanks for having us, Matt.
Elisabeth, obviously you're a known entity to the show. You were on just a few episodes ago talking about that really awesome study that you guys did on TikTok. And I'm going to put a link to the show notes so folks can go back if they happen to miss that one. And if people didn't catch that one, I was wondering if you could just start off by giving us a brief background so people can, put some context to the voice that they're hearing through their earbuds.
Oh, sure. Yes. So we were happy to come on and talk with you about our TikTok study, which was really looking carefully at how information is being shared on that social media platform and the extent to which there's accuracy, inaccuracy, or overgeneralization. So it was great to be on, and just context of who I am. So I'm a psychologist and associate professor at Drexel University, where I lead the clinical core here. So we do a lot of research in addition to clinical facing community work and training. In the context of all that work, there's quite a bit of autism assessment. So I lead a bunch of autism assessment trainings annually. And it's a big part of what I do, which is why I'm really excited to talk more with you about that today.
Great. Can't wait to get into it. Whitney, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Great. So I'm Whitney, and I'm an associate professor at the University of California, San Francisco. And similarly to Elisabeth, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm also a board certified behavior analyst. And I actually got a number of my BCBA units this year, CEUs, by listening to your podcast. So I'm really excited to be here. So they were great. Best way to earn my CEUs, I think. So very happy to be. But similarly to Elisabeth, I do a lot of diagnostic assessment. I also lead assessment trainings. And then a lot of my early training is in naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions. So NDBI broadly, specifically PRT. So really happy to be here and add the lens of assessment as well, since that's something I do really frequently in my day job.
And thank you for the plug for the CEUs. The fruit basket will be coming shortly. So all kidding aside, so I'm going to speak to this as just an observer, I suppose. And it seems to me that people can receive an autism diagnosis in various ways. So one of the first questions I had written down, how is autism diagnosed? And of course, so I'm wondering if you could speak to the various routes one could come by that diagnosis, and maybe, place them in some sort of hierarchy in terms of, best practices and things like that.
Really great question. And you're highlighting that there are a number of ways that individuals are able to get diagnosis. I'll talk first about just the gold standard, or in terms of what really comprehensive assessment looks like. So for an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, and I'm talking specifically about the medical diagnosis, we're really looking at the behavior and getting a behavioral phenotype. And for this diagnosis, there can be different types of approaches where it's just with one provider, so a psychologist, or some places have multidisciplinary approaches, which is a much more comprehensive and time-intensive evaluation, which would involve perhaps a medical provider, the psychologist, speech-language pathologist could be part of that comprehensive team. In general, when we're doing the evaluation, we're really focusing on establishing developmental history of social communication challenges, as well as restricted and repetitive behavior. And we're also doing behavioral assessment of the social communication challenges as well. So part of the evaluation is getting a medical history, a caregiver interview, and it could be a really formal interview using a really standardized assessment, or more of an unstructured interview, getting that developmental history. We always should be assessing cognitive and developmental skills through different measures, depending on the age. So we have different ones based for young children through school age and even adulthood. We're also looking at autism symptoms through direct observation. So the ADOS is the standard semi-structured tool. We then need to look at adaptive behavior. So measures that probably many BCBAs are familiar with, the Vineland or the ABAS. And as children get older, we're looking at co-occurring conditions as well, because there's a lot of overlap. So assessing for ADHD, anxiety, depression, and then language. So those would be like all of the components for a really comprehensive assessment that we would be looking at to establish like a formal diagnosis. But really, it's identifying the social communication and repetitive behavior, the presence of it and the absence of some social communication skills, and assessing it and talking to families and perhaps the adult about the early developmental challenges. So that would be the really broad way and very comprehensive way for assessing autism. And it would be done typically if it's a smaller team. What's happening, it's either psychologists or developmental behavioral pediatrician are often the ones providing the medical diagnosis.
I see. So I live in New Hampshire, and I think there's maybe one or two places that have such a comprehensive level of assessment professionals that can do that type of multidisciplinary team. Yet at the same time, there are quite a number of individuals with autism who may have come to their diagnosis through other means. So I could see how going through the full battery of assessments that you just described would be considered like the best case scenario. And maybe I guess the purpose of this question is not even to perhaps call something good, better, or best, but what are some other ways people come about their diagnoses? Like I've seen individuals just in my own work as a school-based consultant, they went to their pediatrician and they come back with a piece of paper to take to the IEP team. And, so can you talk about some of the other ways in which someone can come about receiving an autism diagnosis?
Yeah, great question. You're right. That's a very what I just described is really comprehensive.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. Yeah, let's more of that, please. Right.
In the context of the world of wait lists, right? Many medical have year-long wait lists, which is a problem because it impacts access to services, as we see, especially with getting ABA. Many families are also like developmental behavioral pediatricians is a really big provider that's doing assessments as well, but they're briefer and they tend to be done in about 1 day. And many of them are using a measure called the CARS, where they're ranking, kind of assessing behavior and then using that to establish the diagnosis. And they may also partner that with a different type of cognitive measure, something called the STAT is what some individuals are using. So developmental pediatricians are doing shorter ones. There's also many other providers, psychologists that are doing briefer, shorter term assessments as well. So it's a 1 day evaluation. And then they may parse out, like if it's more complicated, then adding in these different components to suss out if it's also some other psychiatric condition as part of the picture. But there is a lot of variability. And then, of course, there's private practitioners out doing their own evaluation as well. And so many people are using the ADOS for establishing the diagnosis of autism, but not all. And there is a range depending on where you're going, and how the setup of the clinic or the center or the hospital is, and even what insurance is covering too can also impact what is being done as well, unfortunately.
You did in your description list a number of, I guess, developmental or behavioral markers, if you will. I wonder if this is probably a good time to maybe go through that list in a little bit more detail. So what does it mean to have autism? I know it's kind of like 99% of the audience works with individuals with autism and things like that. But, if you open up the DSM, and this is probably redundant for many listeners, but we also have people coming to this podcast at different points of their educational and practice journeys. So can you go through what does it mean to have autism, and what are some of the, what are some of the things that need to be present or absent in order to qualify for a diagnosis?
Great question. What is autism is a really big question. And we have the criteria as identified in the DSM-5, and we can talk through it. One thing is important to note is that when you've met, and I'm sure everybody's heard this before, so when you've met one person with autism or on the spectrum, you've met one person, right? There's so much variability, and really understanding how language plays a role and development plays a role is going to change the way in which the symptoms really manifest, which makes it all of those aspects of the assessment really essential. And so if we take a step back and think about it from a big picture point of view, we're looking at kind of the absence is how it's described of social communication skills and strategies. So it's kind of it's putting together nonverbal behavior. So maybe poor eye contact, limited use of gestures as a category, then also communication. So difficulty with sustaining conversations back and forth. There's going to be limited conversation back and forth, asking questions, maybe going off on tangents. Those are going to be some big hallmarks, not responding to name. And of course, I'm kind of collapsing a range of them based on different language level too. So there's different ones for like toddlers, what I look for in toddlers versus school age, because how the symptoms manifest change quite dramatically. And we're also looking at challenges with peer relationships as well. So difficulty forming friendships. You might see this as a challenge with kids playing interactively with other children, initiating with them, sustaining the interaction. Maybe they're able to start it, but then it's hard to continue playing with them. There may be rejection on the playground as well. So we're looking for the challenges in relationships as well. And then for this category, restricted and repetitive behavior. Here we're looking for, perhaps odd or idiosyncratic language, different types of intonation. We're looking for the presence of interests or passions, right? The DSM calls it circumscribed interests, but we've really thought about it more as something that somebody is quite interested in and they like. And then also routines or rigidity, liking things to be done in a very specific way. And then the new thing that was added on in the DSM-5 is really sensory. So the being hypersensitive or hyposensitive. So some of the families I work with, the kids don't feel pain at all, and others feel a bit of pain or are really sensitive to sounds and cover their ears with toilets or things like that. So we're just also looking, that's more like the presence of what we're looking for. And what I notice with talking with many people, a lot of individuals sometimes may be looking more for the presence of those types of things versus the absence of the social communication skills. And we need really both for the classification or diagnosis of autism. We need the absence of the social communication and then the presence of the restricted and repetitive behavior.
Yeah, no, I think you summarized that really nicely, Whitney. And I think what I appreciate when we do our diagnostic trainings is trying to basically take observable behaviors and operationalize them in such a way using a tool like the ADOS to map onto those big categories that Whitney just talked about. So on the DSM, when it says, deficit in nonverbal communicative behaviors, what does that actually look like? How is someone interacting and using things like directing their facial expression to share their enjoyment or to convey what they're thinking or feeling to you? How are they using their gaze or other gestures to complement their communication style? Like really trying to break that down in ways that we can see. Are these areas in which there might be the presence of unusual behaviors? So perhaps they're very fixated in using eye contact in an unusual way that changes the cadence of the interaction versus it's not present or it's not modulating and really having that social back and forth. So I do think that's one of the things when we do these, it takes a lot of training more broadly across development. It's not just you're an autism specialist. It's you understand what's supposed to be on board at these various developmental stages so that you can then pick up on the absence of that, which is especially important in young kids.
Hey everyone, a real quick break in this podcast. Balancing work and life can be difficult, and that's why the University of Cincinnati Online has designed a Master's of Education program that is 100% online and asynchronous, which means that you log on when it works for you. Their student success coordinators will work with you from start all the way to graduation to ensure you are receiving the support you need. Graduate in as few as 5 semesters from a top 10 program in total number of graduates and prepare for the BCBA exam. The program is FAFSA eligible, and UC also offers a business partnership program to offer tuition discounts to eligible employees. If you want to learn more, go to online.uc.edu and click the request info button, or just check out the show notes of this episode. I'll have a link for it there. All right, let's get back to this interview. I have a question about the severity of some of these presentations. And I guess I'm talking about the presence of certain characteristics. So I'll ask you to indulge me with a quick story. But I have a friend of mine who's a recent convert to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he can't shut up about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's an intense interest of his. He loves it. He's not on the spectrum, but it's like it's like a joke though. Like, I mean, we're not joking that he's on the spectrum, but it's like one of those things. Like, how do you know someone does jujitsu? You don't have to tell, because they'll tell you. And it's the same thing. Like if someone's like a vegan or a keto diet or something like that, that people who are into those things kind of really like to talk about them. So I guess my question is, what is the degree to which someone has to be focused on a particular area of interest, or on any of those other characteristics that Whitney listed?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the DSM does guide us in that with the social aspects, the social communication, which I conceptualize it really is the two main diagnostic categories, is that first social communication section and then the behavioral section. So the communication section, social communication, we do need to see evidence across all three of those areas that Whitney outlined, versus the behavioral section, we can see just 2 out of 4 to still meet criteria. So what you're getting at, Matt, is, some people might show a really intense interest or enthusiasm about a specific topic, and they can go on and on about it. I think, that's one of those 4 behaviorally. So not all folks with autism have that fixated interest or enthusiasm that becomes sometimes what we think of as all-encompassing. I think it's important to note, though, your story actually resonates, because I actually give this example often when I'm talking about interests, or, as humans, we all have things that we get very excited about and interested in. So your colleague or friend has jiu-jitsu, I have Broadway. Having lived in New York City, Broadway is one of the things I could, geek out about and talk about original Broadway cast recordings and all these other details. And that level of information kind of being like a little professor almost about a topic. Like you can really throw those. And to your point, you gave some other really great examples. People want to talk about those things they know a lot about. But I also think it's how we do that and the way in which we use that socially or not. So I'm not going to meet you and ask the first question, have you seen a show on Broadway? What's your favorite? And go through all that list. I'm going to socially modulate that. And if I find out that you share that enthusiasm with me, we might have that detailed level conversation, and we might connect on that and use that in a social way. And I think a lot of the folks that we work with that are on the spectrum, sometimes we think of those interests or things taking over, and it becomes that hyper focus, and it's all we want to talk about. And the train has left the station. And I might give feedback socially that I'm not really interested in hearing about jiu-jitsu, but you keep going. So I think when it's qualitatively thinking about how we're quantifying impairment, we're taking qualitative information to try to put across different levels. But I think to meet DSM criteria, we do want to see that there's a definite interest or a definite impairment in one of those areas.
I see. That's helpful. One thing I'd also like to ask about is the different levels of impairment or different severities of autism. Can you guys describe what those are, and B, how do you go about, if you have someone that you're doing an assessment on, or the team's doing an evaluation, what tips the scale in terms of, one level or the other?
The DSM has a table actually in the autism section that breaks down some examples, and the levels you're referencing, the table is entitled The Severity Levels of Autism Spectrum Disorder. And each level, being 1, 2, or 3, comes with it a description of the different things we might see in social communication and behavioral presentations. And so I think we've learned, the DSM's been out for going on almost a decade now. And the theory behind this table, or this way of quantifying across these levels, was we really want to help people understand services and supports and who might need the most. But I think one of the things that's really important to note is the research we have on the utility of these to date is somewhat limited. So there's only been a couple of papers really looking at how reliable these are across clinicians, for example. And I think ultimately the behaviors that you are measuring during your evaluation are what are going to determine, the extent to which level 1 is requiring support, level 2 is requiring substantial support, and level 3 very substantial support. And the idea is that the kind of level 3 being they use words like severe deficits, very limited, those types of there's clear gaps, and that is causing great distress for folks. And so I think this is an example of why it's really important to have multiple informants, and that you're not just spending a half hour with someone, because it would be impossible to really gauge the extent to which these behaviors are really getting in the way or causing those challenges day to day. And for me, honestly, I don't find these severity levels to be as helpful, because the reality is people on the spectrum can move pretty quickly during their development and have strengths and challenges across their social communication and across their behavior, that it's actually more meaningful for me when I'm working with a family to think about, where is this child's adaptive behavior skills? What goals are we working on in trying to build more functional communication? And that for me, it's not, are they a level 1 or are they a level 2? It's, let's see where they are right now at this stage in time, and then reassess as we move forward. Whitney, I'm not sure if there's other things you want to add there.
I just want to echo what you just said regarding finding the levels not as useful. I do the same thing with families. And if a family comes in saying my child's at a level 1, I really spend the time to educate them in terms of what that means with the family, and also explain that it may change over time, right? Because autism's developmental, and the different needs will look different. The one thing that I'm worried about with the levels is it may sometimes we see it as almost gatekeeping with access to services I'm in California, and we have a regional center system. And so some regional centers will limit access to services based on the level that you've been identified. So we just need to be careful with the interpretation of the levels, and really think about the whole person and across the different domains, because that's focusing on autism symptoms, but there may be other aspects of behavior or adaptive behavior that impact the functioning or the quality of life of the individual.
Hey everyone, just another quick break here. I know I mentioned this at the beginning of the show, but I wanted to remind you that the Verbal Behavior Conference is coming right around the corner here. It's going down on February 29th and March 1st. Yes, it's on a leap year, I guess you could say. There is also a full day workshop from Dr. Lena Slim on the 28th as well. So if you want to check it out, either in person in Austin, Texas, or virtually through Behavior Live, go to behaviorlive.com/VBC to learn more. You can see all the speakers like Drs. Alice Schillingsberg, Pat McGreevy, of course, very much a fan favorite at that conference. Yeah, it's just a really fun time. This will be my third or fourth one. Lots of opportunities for individual interactions with the presenters, plus a panel discussion moderated by yours truly. So whether virtually or in person, I hope to see you there in late February, early March. Just to clarify, is that and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so please correct me if I don't have this right, but is that another way of saying that, individuals can have severe challenges regardless of where they fall into those severity categories, and as such, we, have to be careful about how funding gets allocated? Or I hear some of these discussions sometimes where, I could see on the one hand people who have children who are, very, profoundly impacted. Obviously, those individuals require, in some cases, perhaps many cases, 24/7 support. That was one of the first jobs I got out of graduate school, was working in a residential facility for individuals with very severe and profound disabilities. And then we've got individuals who, have, YouTube channels and podcasts and things like that, but maybe, I guess, impacted in other ways that are serious as well. I don't know if there's a question in that in there or not, but it seems to me like a really difficult thing to kind of parse.
Yeah, I think what you were saying, it is a difficult thing to parse, and knowing that individuals may change levels. And of course, the profound, like we can talk later too about profound or the other difficulties when families do need that substantial support. I think I'm also just speaking about just not wanting the levels to determine access to services. That's more what I get worried in terms of the insurance world or access to service world, because someone may have low social communication needs, but they may have impairments with scheduling or accessing curriculum or other elements that aren't really captured from those levels. And so it's looking at the whole person and other things that they may need in order to be successful and get through school or be successful after college, those types of behaviors.
Great. I appreciate the clarification. Despite the fact we acknowledge that there's, the levels can be, not as helpful as perhaps we might like. What do we know about the distribution of people with autism across these levels? Do we have those data?
It's a good question. I think the answer is we have some data, and it's challenging in some ways because, the best data we have from a monitoring perspective, or to answer, from a kind of thinking more epidemiologically, where folks are in their levels of functioning, it's so affected by someone's language ability and intellectual functioning. So it's really hard to uncouple the autism symptomatology from those two other domains. So I think we do know the CDC does a report that looks very carefully at data over time for all folks that are diagnosed, children at the age of 8 who have an autism diagnosis. And it's the Autism Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. So it's a national effort from the CDC. And over time, the most recent report actually came out earlier this year, and it was looking at data from the 2020 record review. And so there was a real big split around, historically, it was thought many people with autism also had that comorbid intellectual disability. But the most recent data actually showed that about 38% or so, not a little more than a third, had an IQ that's less than or equal to 70, with the other almost 2/3 in either that, low average borderline or higher range. So I think it's helpful to think about that from a perspective of what we're seeing. And I think some of the DSM changes when 10 years ago now, the DSM-5 came out, and we think about autism spectrum disorder, whereas historically we had those different categories in which, a lot of reasons are accounting just for that broader prevalence. But I think one of the pieces we want to think about is the extent to which we're identifying a lot more folks that are verbal and that have those higher cognitive abilities as well. So that helps us get a sense of the spread of different folks across the spectrum.
You touched on something I wanted to get into, so I'm glad you brought it up, and that is the change from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5 and what was left behind and what was changed as a consequence of that. So I'm old enough to be familiar with terms like Asperger syndrome, PDD-NOS, and things along those lines that seem to have some face validity to them in terms of like, this person, intense interest, very verbal, very bright, talks a mile a minute, not a lot of, kind of not taking social cues. That seems to be someone who is probably more likely to be accounted for with something like Asperger syndrome or something like that. So I guess I'm curious in terms of what was, I'm trying not to ask your opinion. I want to keep this very, very factual based, but if opinion would help, by all means add it. But I'm just curious what your, as people in the assessment world, what was either gained by this or perhaps lost by this transition from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, or how do we make sense with people who are previously diagnosed with things like Asperger's and PDD-NOS and things like that? Where might those people fall these days, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a good question and a big one. Yeah. So I'll start and then ask Whitney to chime in. I think in general, the main driving force behind that transition from those distinct categories that you just mentioned, so autistic disorder being separate from Asperger's, which is separate from pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, was really coming down to the fact that as a field, we were actually not doing a very good job from a reliability perspective of differentiating kids across those categories. And ultimately, especially with the Asperger's group, the idea that early language being delayed or not was part of the difference there. And ultimately, you could see a 10-year-old who had autistic disorder diagnosis versus a 10-year-old who had the Asperger's diagnosis at a young age. And phenotypically, or what you're seeing behaviorally, could look really overlapping and similar and be almost really impossible to differentiate. And so there was a lot of data actually from many, many studies that was looking at the idea that really states, there was a lot of variability across states where, for example, in California, the diagnosis of autistic disorder was actually opening more doors to services than the other two categories. So to what extent were clinicians using the diagnosis that would leverage more supports and services for the families, and how useful is that from an etiological perspective? I think one thing, though, that we're noticing and that there's a lot of talk about is what we've already talked about, the heterogeneity and the idea that there are so many different domains across these folks who, a 20-year-old who might be minimally verbal and be home with their family, need 24-hour around the care clock. And some folks are advocating for the term profound autism versus the 20-year-old who is at an Ivy League college and, has that same diagnosis. That I hear from a lot of parents in particular, like, this diagnosis is meaningless. If they're saying my son has this same thing that this person that's going to engineering doctoral programming is, like, what does this actually mean? And I think that's where when Whitney was speaking earlier about using those specifiers and having a really good sense of what are we looking at from a language development perspective, cognitive development perspective, adaptive skill range, like those areas are just as important in these assessments so that we can have a full picture of this person's strengths and challenges. Because ultimately, it'll be interesting to see where the field goes, but the idea of trying to cleave off or separate out groups has just been historically very challenging to do. But we're also acknowledging having everyone under the same umbrella presents different challenges.
All right. I know nobody ever skips the opening remarks, but just in case someone might have, or maybe you were distracted or something else caught your attention and you weren't able to listen, I do want to remind you that if you are looking for continuing ed, you can go to behavioralobservations.com, get CEUs, and pick from almost 50 different events that we have. There are a variety of topics with a lot of your favorite podcast guests. So whether you're looking for resources for supervision, ethics, functional assessment, all sorts of things, you can just go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs and see if there is something there that strikes your interest. I want to get into some other, terms or labels and things like that in a second, but I'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the topic of self-diagnosis. This is something you see a lot in online communities and things along those lines. I don't know what the literature says about self-diagnosis. Obviously, just on its face, it seems like it's fraught with all sorts of challenges. I can understand people being resource or limited. I just described how, to get a multidisciplinary assessment in the way that you guys have described, here in, rural states, is difficult and things like that. So I'm also, want to be charitable towards people who have limited resources, access, etc. Yeah. So, what do we know about self-diagnosis in terms of, have there been any studies on it in terms of, maybe having folks who are self-diagnosed being followed up and going through a more comprehensive treatment battery, and do those match or not? I'm just pulling this out of thin air, but I'm just the concept itself is I'm just very curious about.
Yeah, it's a big topic, and I think it's one that we don't unfortunately have a ton of data on, and we need to do some research on, because to your point, we definitely have these issues with access. And often, sometimes in online communities and places like TikTok or other social media, there is this sentiment of gatekeeping and the idea that the medical establishment is gatekeeping services away from folks. And I think one of the responsibilities we have as a field is to think a lot about the medical diagnosis and how that might look different from social model and identifying with aspects or attributes related to something like an autism spectrum disorder. And I personally, in my practice, have had many adolescents and young adults referred or come and say, I talked to so-and-so and I'm sure that I have it because I do the same 3 things that he does or that she does. And I think we live in a world now where there's such access to immediate information, some of which is misinformation, which we've already talked about. And I think there's something to be said for us trying to make sure that we're doing right by the people who are seeking the answers and to figure out a way to more efficiently see more people while also not compromising the integrity of the evaluations and ensuring that autism is truly a developmental disorder. So these challenges that arise don't just pop up in your later teens or 20s. Having that developmental history and having that thorough diagnostic assessment really is what is going to answer those questions. And we can't do that in the context of someone, just saying, because of these 3 things, I know that I have X. And that holds true for any diagnosis. I don't think that's autism specific. I think across mental health arena, we're thinking a lot about this and how to help people in those moments.
Is it the case that sometimes you have someone come into your clinic or practice or whatever and say, hey, I've got, because of X, Y, and Z, I feel like I have autism. You go through the assessment battery and they don't meet the criteria for an autism spectrum disorder?
Definitely. And I think especially it's our responsibility as clinicians doing these evaluations to have that conversation with people up front, especially even at the intake level, to say, these are the procedures and processes by which we make determinations. And ultimately, if you identify with this diagnosis, it's not my job to tell you how to or to not identify. Like, you as a human can certainly identify with that. But a medical diagnosis, there is a certain standard by which we need to have evidence across these various areas. And a level of current impairment or some sort of something getting in your way is part of that. So especially folks who come in more from a curiosity perspective and, everything's going great. And they have what they call, I had one adult, it was a parent actually of a child I'd seen and said, I've got these quirks. I've always wondered about these quirks. And we did a full eval, and ultimately they definitely had some characteristics of autism, but not that full picture that we need for a diagnosis. So we were able, to have that conversation about what does this mean to you at the beginning of the process? Because there are some folks for whom they might not want to go through that whole process, not only the time investment, but the financial investment, because the answer they get on the other side might not change their life one way or the other, versus other folks who really want that clearer picture and they're willing to go through and be prepared to hear one way versus the other.
Given the comorbidity with other challenges, I suppose, do you ever go through that process and say, hey, you don't have autism, but you may want to get an assessment for anxiety or, depression or, something else along those lines. In other words, it might be that people might be thinking autism and maybe maybe the presenting symptoms are more better described as, under some other diagnostic condition or umbrella. Do you ever run across something like that?
Absolutely. And I think actually the best evaluations, hopefully you're able to actually incorporate additional measures to make those recommendations and potentially even those diagnoses. So the idea that there is a ton of overlap with certain aspects related to anxiety or mood disorders, attention, those types of things you can incorporate. And often actually, if I'm saying it's not autism, my hope is I'm saying it's X instead. So it actually is giving that framework and that really, goal guideline or roadmap for that family or that person for where they go from here, and just not kicking it down the road to say, now go get on this other waiting list where this person might be able to give you that actual diagnosis.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And obviously people are coming in, or I'm assuming people are coming into the clinic because there's some level of suffering, and to have a direction to pursue, based on an accurate diagnosis sounds helpful. A couple other terms that come up. One, I know we talked about, some of the, in terms of, PDD, NOS, and Asperger's and things like that, of terms that have kind of gone by the wayside. There's a new term or maybe not, it's new to me. I've seen it pop up here and there over the last year or two that I'd like to bring up. It's called pathological demand avoidance. It's my understanding it's not necessarily in the DSM-5, but there's a lot of discussion about it. And I know families are asking providers about it. I'd be curious, what do we know about this term? Is there any literature on it in terms of, its, prevalence, et cetera, and things like that? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on PDA.
Thank you for bringing up this question. And interestingly enough, it's been coming up a lot more in our clinic. And then just this morning, I got an email from one of our psychiatry fellows whose family is also bringing up PDA. So I think it's a worthwhile discussion and something for for practitioners and clinicians to be aware of. There's a lot of social media about it too. If you look at Instagram, lots of parents and caregivers identifying their children as having PDA. And so the whole idea really of it is emerging. It's not, as you said, it's not in the DSM-5. I think we need to acknowledge that there's lots of limits with the research on it. There's not really, I can't think of many studies at all that have looked at the PDA. So we have bad data. We have like anecdotal information from families that we've been working with. There seems to be some significant overlap with individuals who have autism or even individuals that aren't on the spectrum as well. Families are identifying it or finding it to be helpful. When we first think about PDA, it's defined really, so pathological demand avoidance. It's people who have it or families who think have their children identify as having it. It's really this adverse reaction to being told to do something or how to behave, even if that one thing that they're being asked to do is just part of what they need to do, like brushing their teeth or getting told to eat breakfast and then get ready for school, get in the car, then go to school, that it's just these constant demands throughout the day that they have marked resistance to doing these aspects when they're being told to do something. And so it's just quite extreme. It tends to interfere with functioning at home and at school. And sometimes it can seem like just willful defiance, but it might be that there's a lot of anxiety around what they're being asked to do or inflexibility around what they're being asked to do. And that this external demand could be producing a lot of just discomfort. And then it's leading to this avoidance is what our families are saying is working. And the families that I've heard talk about it, they just feel like standard behavioral strategies aren't working for them, and that their children they've described it as like in complete burnout phase and not responsive to anything. And they're quite overwhelmed. I think when families bring it up, they have some shame around it. A lot of the families talk about feeling alone and that providers don't understand what they're going through. And they're saying, please live in my house and see what this experience is like. I think there's just a lot of information that we still need to gather about it. We've heard talks on this because it's been coming up in a lot more of the community. There's many parents who are just really advocating for this kind of perspective or viewpoint. Humbly, I don't know a ton about it. I'm just seeing it come up a lot more in practice. And I think really when I think about it with the family, I'm thinking about trying to understand what's the function of the behavior. What are they trying to avoid? What is the response style? And think about it more as a profile for the child, or how can we make things work differently? Like, okay, so that behavioral strategy isn't working. What could we do instead? How can we make this collaborative so it doesn't seem like this demand? How can we work with the child to figure out what it is, that they want? What are their motivations? It's a lot of it, I think about using naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, really not just behavior consequence, but let's harness their motivations. What is it that they want to do? How can we capitalize on that? If they really are interested in Minecraft, let's use that as strategies to help support the child with learning certain types of skills. And how can we impact and improve the quality of life? for the family and the parents. But I know I said a lot about PDA, but I think we just need to think very, like, as we do with autism, about the whole child and the whole picture, and think about the behavior, and then create individualized intervention plans to help support them, and also hear the family, and keep in mind that the family may have a lot of shame with even bringing this up. This is what I've heard parents especially talk about, because they just don't feel understood, I think, in the treatment world.
Yeah, it sounds like an area that's probably wide open for research if people are out there and have a topic they're looking to sink their teeth into. As you're describing the repertoire or the profile, I'm thinking repertoire too. Obviously, given where I come from, certainly, and it would be interesting if you had a cohort of individuals where you did a very thorough functional assessment and applied some interventions and things like that. And maybe that stuff's been done already. I don't know. It's not a topic that I've done a deep dive on from a PubMed or Google Scholar standpoint. All right. Another word I guess would be remiss not to bring up here. And I really want to carefully think about how we talk about this. My goal is to do it as sensitively as possible, but is the term, what does it mean to be neurodiverse, neurodiversity, neurodivergent? They're very, permutations of that word. And and I want to talk about this with just, want to narrow the focus as it relates to assessment and the types of supports that you provide. So one of the things I'll admit to be somewhat reluctant to really leaning into this term is that it seems to encompass a number of different, conditions. And at the same time, I get the sense when people say neurodiversity, it conjures up autism, even though it's purported to describe a variety of different conditions. So I'm again, not so much as a question. I'm just more curious what your thoughts are on this term.
Yeah, it's a good point, Matt, that probably warrants its own show. And I think thinking about it in the context of assessment, and certainly that's something Whitney and I are hearing a lot from families, from individuals with whom we work. And the idea that neurodiversity describes ways in which people experience and interact with the world around them in different ways, that there's not one, quote, right way to think, learn, behave, and the differences are not viewed as deficits. And so I think, from this framework, we're learning a lot, and we're hearing a lot from groups of folks who are able to communicate for themselves. We acknowledge there are many folks that are on the spectrum who cannot communicate for themselves. And so I think therein lies the backdrop that we just need to be thinking a lot about. And as you said, neurodiversity more broadly is thinking about across a lot of different areas, not just autism. So the idea that there are differences in ways people think and learn in autism, but also in ADHD and other learning disabilities. And I think we think a lot about in our autism space in particular, what does it mean? Like, what is our role in this world in which the medical model is dictating diagnoses and is dictating supports and services? And the manual that we've referenced a lot during this hour, the DSM, uses words like deficit, impairment, dysfunction. And so we are based in this world that is in some ways counter to this idea that everyone thinks that it's a difference, it's not a deficit. And so I think the number one thing that I have found helpful is thinking about, words really matter. And a lot of our medical model process focuses so much on what's not going right. And I think hearing from autistic people that say, I acknowledge when I read my report, all I heard about was all the ways that something was wrong with me. There was nothing about the areas of strength or the things that I'm good at or the things that make me a human. And I think that's something as a field, as we're writing reports in particular, that clinicians really need to keep in mind. Again, certainly not everyone on the spectrum will be able to read their own reports one day, but the idea that many folks do grow up and have their medical records and have access to see what they looked like as a younger child. And I think for me, there is this movement afoot, especially listening to autistic clinicians in particular. So people that have that lived experience and can explain what it was like when these various things were happening to them from a sensory perspective or otherwise. And I think we as clinicians, as we're writing things up, really thinking about how we're framing the deficits and making sure it's a fine line we have to walk to ensure that the reports will still help families access services and frame that there is enough to justify this diagnosis, while at the same time really emphasizing those strengths and remembering to emphasize the differences that we all have. And I think too, as a society, the idea of inclusivity and the idea that we all, that's where I think the neurodiversity movement has been the loudest and in some ways most productive way, that it's more broadly, it's not just autism. It's that we all function and think differently, and that we should be more inclusive and have that more, embrace those differences that people do show.
For me, it's, again, I'm just speaking for myself. It does seem challenging because, again, what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, people are coming to your clinics. I'm assuming, but I think it's fair to say either the people are coming on their own or people are coming with their parents to address the symptoms. So it's hard to, I have to imagine it must be difficult to craft an assessment that describes the diagnostic aspects of one's symptom presentation in such a way, because you have to talk. No, they're not. People, I'm making the assumption here, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong. People aren't coming to you guys because things are awesome, right? That there's some suffering happening, and you have to talk about that suffering in the context of a diagnosis that will hopefully lead to an evidence-based treatment, and do so in a way that is clear. Yeah, for me, I'm just, I guess, marveling at the challenge of having to address both of those aspects of describing these phenomenon that you guys are asked to contend with.
You're hitting the nail on the head, right? It can be quite hard to toe both lines while I was trained in describing things in a strength-based way. And then also being in academic medical center, needing the reports to justify types of services. And so it is really hard to balance both parts. Speaking to people coming to the door, right, with symptoms or challenges that need to be addressed, I would say that by and far, majority of the people coming in are having significant challenges. There have been some of the group where it was more just a curiosity, is it autism or not? And we've made a hard line that if it is a curiosity-based decision where you're not having challenges day to day, we're not seeing those individuals. Not that it's not important. It's a very important question, but given lack of resources, we're giving number of referrals of people who are doing those types of assessments. But I would say that when I'm seeing a teen or a young adult, I'm also spending additional time and writing it's called therapeutic assessment letter. It's based on Stephen Finn's writing and how to make it more therapeutic and describe with what some of the behaviors are or some of the challenges that they're experiencing, so that there's two types of reports. It's much more time intensive, but it really shows that we're hearing what their challenges are and illuminating things in a different way to help hold them, and something that they can look back onto that's less medical based is something that we've been doing in our program specifically to try to hold both.
And you called it a therapeutic assessment letter. And who is the author of that?
Stephen Finn is the type of who's developed it. It really came from a different field of assessment, not autism assessment, but I've liked the style, and there's lots of different styles, but it's you came in asking this type of question, why are social interactions hard for me? And then you may describe it in a way that feels really humanistic and helpful for processing, and that they can look back, and families and individuals have appreciated reading it in this way. So it's just a different way.
And I'll just add on there too. I think Whitney hit on something that's really important, is actually working with the family and the individual, if possible, to help them understand those differences. So I've had lots of, especially that kind of emerging school age, the kiddos, where we're actually telling them about their diagnosis and the idea of their brain working differently that it's, different, not less, that there are these areas in which you find yourself really struggling at school and that we need to put in some supports to help you in those ways. But I think I've found a lot of kids over the years that self-deprecation, like something's wrong with me, something's broken. And I do think reframing and thinking more in that context of, yes, these are challenges and these are ways in which you have these beautiful strengths and other things that are going really well for you, that you can understand your own profile and how you learn differently potentially.
That's really helpful. I'm going to try to run that down for the show notes, the therapeutic assessment letter. That sounds like it would be helpful to a lot of folks in the audience. So really difficult stuff. I appreciate you guys walking through that with the level of sensitivity that you did. I guess more generally here, this is a really complex topic that, people have spent many, many graduate seminar classes to really wrap their arms around. And I was going to use the word master, but I don't know if anyone truly masters this. It's kind of like, you're always pushing that rock up the hill in terms of learning more. All of that to say, I think we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but I think it's probably a good time as any to wrap up. I just wanted to give you guys an opportunity. If there's anything else about assessment of autism that we haven't discussed thus far that you'd like to say without opening up another giant rabbit hole to jump into, now would be the time to do it. If not, we'll say goodbye and maybe have you back for some follow-up discussion.
I'll hop in just to reiterate something we touched on in the very beginning that I think is important that your listeners, especially the draw you have of many different disciplines, including BCBAs, doing a lot more training. We're having more BCBAs come to our autism diagnostic assessment trainings and think about, how am I using this in my practice? And I think just the reminder to put out there that every single state has their own governing laws and rules by which different practices and different disciplines are working. And I think reminding folks just to check in with their licensing bodies and where they are in a practice group. Because, for example, I've worked with many BCBA clinics in certain states that they have a great pairing with, say, a developmental behavioral pediatrician's office where they can do these combined evaluations. And it works really well. So I think it is increasing access in an exciting way by getting more and more folks trained. But I also think just that word of, due diligence when it comes to making sure that you're working within a system that will lead to diagnoses families can actually use.
Whitney, Elisabeth, thank you so much for joining me today. I really learned a lot, and I think the audience has too.
Thank you to the Behavioral Observer podcast with Matt. You can find Matt on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.